Well, I'm glad Dominic said that we're going to something different to prepare the way, but I hope it will be an excursion that you find fruitful. I'm going to be talking about architecture, particularly in light of John Ruskin's two works, The Seven Lamps of Architecture and the Stones of Venice, and apply those to a couple of modern, or I guess we could say contemporary, architects and builders. And you'll probably recognize them, or at least you may recognize their work. So I will move right into it. I did think about looking at the construction or the architecture of Oral Roberts University as part of this talk, but I thought it might be a little bit too much to get into. But who knows, maybe in the future that will be the case. I will have some illustrations throughout, and that is to show you some things that John Ruskin would have found interesting or very much something that should happen in architecture. John Ruskin, by the way, was a Victorian. He's especially known for being an art critic. He was responsible for the Pre-Raphaelite movement in some ways. He encouraged it and gave it the impetus to go. So if you love any of those Pre-Raphaelite paintings, John Ruskin is part of the reason you have those even today. He also did a lot of illustrations, and I'll have some of those throughout, especially of St. Mark's Cathedral. This is an illustration of Dolge's Palace in Venice. It's not an illustration, it's an actual photograph. And he was the one responsible for having that building gain preeminence. He loved Venice, and he wrote about it in his notebooks, and people now know about that particular palace because of John Ruskin. All right, well, let's dive right in. This is an illustration of St. Mark's. John Ruskin, in The Seven Lamps of Architecture, defines architecture as the art which so disposes and adorns the edifices raised by men that the sight of them may contribute to his mental health, power, and pleasure. He has 7 lamps, or spirits, or laws of architecture. I want to go through those quickly. This is a very short summary. But architecture is an offering to God, demonstrating men's love and obedience and surrender of themselves and theirs to His will, as evidenced by the building of beautiful ornate churches. That's the first law, the law of sacrifice. The second law, or the second lamp, is truth. Builders must use honest and true materials crafted by human hands, not machines, respecting them and rejecting false ones. The third one is power. The construction of buildings must focus on mass, quantity of shadow, breadth, sense of surface, size, weight, and shadow, and the efforts of the builders through their imagination should point toward the sublimity and majesty of nature. The fourth law, architecture should point individuals toward God and reflect the design and decoration found in nature. So the fourth law is beauty. The fifth law is life. Buildings should bear the mark of human hands, celebrating their regularity and design to show that the ornamentation is not mechanical, and demonstrating the joy of the builders as they construct with freedom. So very much against mechanical building. You want a more natural building. Memory, architecture should respect the social, historical, and cultural character of its milieu, distinguishing between essential and inessential forms. And the seventh one, the seventh lamp, is obedience. Originality must recognize and be restrained by obedience to tradition, especially connecting with the English architecture that has preceded it. These are his guidelines then for what he considers good architecture. If we want to look at that in an illustration, which I'm a very visual person, here we have one. You see that everything emanates from God or points to God, and you see the connections that he makes and how it's connected with nature, with society and the individual, and with history and with the present. And with all of those, you have the 7 lamps distributed with sacrifice, beauty, power, obedience, life, memory, and truth. He says that good and beautiful theological architecture must meet these laws, and the observer should see that there is room for the marking of man's relations with the mightiest as well as the fairest works of God, and that those works themselves have been permitted by their architect's master and man's to receive an added glory from their association with earnest efforts of human thought. So the connection with God is what's being emphasized there. So therefore, according to Ruskin, architecture that reflects these 7 lamps will draw the builder and the observer toward an experience with the master builder, God. Now, in his later book, The Stones of Venice, Ruskin points out the 3 virtues of a building. He says that it act well, that it speak well, and that it look well. Some good guiding principles, I think. An example for him would be this Chestertown Hall, 1863 to 1869. It has some polychromy Ruskinian Gothic. He was very interested in the Gothic, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But he liked the multicolored brick. He liked the design, the Gothic design in the windows. And then this is one, another All Saints was influenced by Ruskin's essay with its structural use of brick rather than just for decoration. It was actually used as part of the structure itself. Now, he also linked this to morals. He appealed to what he called a moral architecture, and he encouraged builders to reject the techniques of the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, and to go back to a time when the best buildings were constructed, the medieval Gothic cathedrals of England and Venice, which he talks about in his later book, The Stones of Venice. Okay, so he wrote the 7 lamps first and then the Stones of Venice to give examples to illustrate what he talked about in the first one. In the Stones of Venice, Ruskin sees the moral elements of the Gothic as the following: savageness, changefulness, naturalism, grotesqueness, rigidity, and redundance when belonging to the building, and when belonging to the builder, he called them savageness or rudeness, love of change, love of nature, disturbed imagination, obstinacy, and generosity as characteristics, or what he called the moral elements of the Gothic. So he would look for this in the builder and the building. He would look for these. In The Crown of Wild Olive, Ruskin says that he authored the Stones of Venice, quote, to show that certain right states of temper and moral feeling were the magic powers by which all good architecture, without exception, had been produced. The Stones of Venice had, from beginning to end, no other aim than to show that the Gothic architecture of Venice had arisen out of and indicated in all its features a state of pure national faith and of domestic virtue, and that its Renaissance architecture had arisen out of and in all its features indicated a state of concealed national infidelity and of domestic corruption. So again, he appeals to the Gothic and saying, hey, this is our virtuous example. The Renaissance, nah, that's infidelity and corruption. Now, we have then his focus on a very important building for him, and that is St. Mark's of Venice. Again, we have more illustrations of Ruskin as I go through this. And he has this beautiful and eloquent description of the building. And I thought that would help if I shared that with you, get a feel for his connection to beauty. So we talked about his connection to morality, and now we're talking about his connection to beauty. So here's his description. A multitude of pillars and white domes clustered into a long, low pyramid of colored light, a treasure heap, it seems, partly of gold and partly of opal and mother of pearl, hollowed beneath into 5 great vaulted porches sealed with fair mosaic, and beset with sculpture of alabaster, clear as amber and delicate as ivory, sculpture fantastic and involved of palm leaves and lilies and grapes and pomegranates and birds clinging and fluttering among the branches, all twined together into an endless network of buds and plumes. And in the midst of it, the solemn form of angels, sceptered and robed to the feet, and leaning to each other across the gates, their figures indistinct among the gleaming of the golden ground, through the leaves beside them, interrupted and dim like the morning light as it faded back among the branches of Eden, when first its gates were angel guarded long ago. One sentence. The second sentence. And round the walls of the porches there are set pillars of variegated stones, jasper and porphyry, and deep green serpentine spotted with flakes of snow and marbles that half refuse and half yield to the sunshine, Cleopatra-like, their bluest veins to kiss. The shadow as it steals back from them, revealing line after line of azure undulation as the receding tide leaves the wave sand, their capitals rich with interwoven tracery, rooted knots of herbage and drifting leaves of acanthus and vine and mystical signs, all beginning and ending in the cross. And above them in the broad archivolts, a continuous chain of language and of life, angels in the sign of heaven and the labors of men, each in its appointed season upon earth, and above these another range of glittering pinnacles, mixed with white arches, edged with scarlet flowers.
Take a breath.
Confusion of light amidst which the breasts of the Greek horses are seen, blazing in their breadth of golden strength, and the St. Mark's lion lifted on a blue field covered with stars, until at last, as if in ecstasy, the crests of the arches break into a marble foam and toss themselves far into the blue sky and flashes and wreaths of sculptured spray, as if the breakers on the Lido shore had been frostbound before they fell, and the sea nymphs had inlaid them with coral and amethyst. I put the pictures in there so it would kind of keep your interest while I was reading through that. But you do see how he is captivated by the beauty of St. Mark's and uses this as an illustration, a very important one in his works. And this is what it actually looks like. St. Mark's Cathedral is quite magnificent, and you can see why he was inspired by that. And then this is his drawing of it, which is a nice rendition. He was a very good illustrator.
Is that Orthodox?
Yes, I believe it is. And there's the archivolt he was talking about, which is the archway. Now, as appealing as Ruskin is, I think, and interesting, he did have some criticism, and I thought we really needed to look at that before we continued on. One was by Professor Robert Kerr, who lived during the time of John Ruskin. He actually believed the way Ruskin did until he worked 20 years in the field, and then he changed his mind. And so he encouraged experienced architects to deter younger apprentices from the idealistic and romanticized views of Ruskin, because Kerr viewed the architect as a servant of the public for the efficient design of buildings, precisely like the engineer. I had to get engineer in there a couple of times. So I'm not sure. Yeah. When he presented a lecture entitled Architectural Criticism at the Royal Institute of British Architects, he criticized Ruskin, saying that, quote, Mr. Ruskin's thoughts soar high enough in the poetry of visionary art because poetry is his business, but they cannot stoop down to the plain prosaic details of the structuresque because building is not his business. So there's an architect criticizing Ruskin. In October 1849, a review was written in the Journal of Design over the Seven Lamps of Architecture, and one commentator admired the excellent spirit that was present in this thoughtful, eloquent book. However, he points out that Ruskin either puts his back against further development or would attempt to bring back the world of art to what its course of actions was 4 centuries ago. So another criticism. Now, to go to a contemporary critic, John Mattinson, this article in 2002, he talks about the building of the Crystal Palace, which actually happened during the time of Ruskin, when he's writing all this and having these exclamations about architecture and writing this. He says, citing the building of the Crystal Palace, whose prefabricated components heralded a revolution, which was occurring at the same time as the Stones of Venice was published, John Mattinson says, Ruskin's ideas were already destined for quaintness in the 1850s. Now, I'm not putting this here to just diss Ruskin, but I thought I need to give you a fair and balanced view, especially with engineers here, because sometimes you may not have that poetic spirit as much. Now that may be an assumption, and I could be wrong, and if I am, please forgive me. But I thought I'll bring this part in. Well, Mattinson continues this. He says, since Ruskin's time, populations have grown and economic systems have expanded with once unimaginable speed. Construction in our time has to be fast. It must be efficient. It must avoid unnecessary expense. If Ruskin foresaw the further mechanization of physical labor, he was at least spared the sadness of seeing how far that mechanization would eventually extend. Ruskin also did not anticipate that the alienation that he saw as poisoning the life of the worker might someday encompass not only the process of construction, but also those of conception and design. He could never have imagined online catalogs of design components, or the idea that an architect might one day resolve decisions of ornamentation, not with painstaking manual drawing or model building, but with the click of a mouse. Neither could he have expected that modern buildings would often be commissioned and designed not by individuals at all, but by impersonal organizations. It would have been strange indeed for Ruskin to discover the myriad ways in which architecture could divorce itself from the simple human acts of drawing and carving. So Mattinson is saying, Ruskin may not have seen some of the things, or probably didn't see some of the things that we experience today if you're an architect. But Mattinson does not wholly dismiss Ruskin. He looks at the construction of St. John the Divine in Manhattan, which is sometimes called the unfinished cathedral or the never-ending building, because it's still not finished. They've been working on it. This is in 1972, and they had a fire in 2001, I think it was, and it just goes on and on. But in 1972, after no construction occurred on the building for 30 years, the dean of St. John the Divine proclaimed that it was time to begin work again, and that the stonework would be done by our own unemployed and underemployed neighbors. We will revive the art of stonecraft. Matson observes, the spirit of the new construction was profoundly Ruskinian. It entrusted a sacred Gothic edifice to hands that would begin the project raw and untutored, in expectation that, as the structure grew and took shape, so too would the skills and souls of the workers, that the cathedral actually did become a literal synthesis of stone cutting and soul making, an exemplar of Ruskin's demand that the work must affirm the passion of the worker, seems to be confirmed in the words of Simon Verity, one of the master carvers employed in the project. He said, to be a carver, you have to have a passion for it, to love it with all your heart. It's a desire to create order out of chaos, to seek harmonies. So, he concludes then, surely Ruskin would have applauded this method of construction, a combination, someone has said, of outreach and upreach. And yet his applause might have been tempered by the knowledge how deeply the impersonality of technology and profit had insinuated themselves into the building of the cathedral. Hence you see the conflict involved with Ruskin. Here's a picture of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the western facade. And you see the rose window, it's beautiful. And then there's the wide angle view of that. Ruskin was also a social critic, but I'm going to move ahead through this because I've got a lot to say. Now I want to talk about, I spent all this time kind of setting the background for Ruskin, and I said, I want to use him as a palimpsest for modern architecture. Now, what do I mean by that? So I want to just provide a little background to that, and then I'll make the application. Palimpsest is from palimpsestos, meaning scratched or scraped again. It's a papyrus or other kind of writing material on which two or more sets of writing had been superimposed in such a way that because of imperfect erasure, some of the earlier text could be read through overwriting. So if you look at this is a Georgian palimpsest of the 5th, 6th century. Can you see how the writing is going one way and then it's going another way. And that's because there was writing on one side, and it would be erased. And then there's writing on the other side, now the new side, and it's repurposed. A very famous one is the Archimedes, Palimpsest, and that actually has, this is a 12th century prayer book, and underneath it, it has a 10th century copy of two works that we didn't know until we discovered that this was a palimpsest. So that's kind of interesting. And then this is what it looks like under ultraviolet light. So you can see the text going one way and the text going another way. It has diagrams. It's really interesting. You can look at this on the internet and see some of it. Okay, so then we have the definition. This is a definition then of palimpsest as applied to architecture. In my proposal for rhetorical figures, architecture is no longer elements, but an other grammatical counter proposing an alternate reading of the idea of site and object. In this sense, a rhetorical figure will be seen to be inherently contextual in that the site is treated as a deeply scored palimpsest. And then if you look at my other italicized line there, the analogic or rhetorical rather than analytic character of this process dislocates site implications from their culturally predetermined meanings by superposing two old contents to create new content. So the bottom line is you have what's left over from the previous history or architecture that becomes this palimpsest upon which is built the new architecture. And Ruskin talks about this idea of the theory of associationism, which connects to history, and that influences his aesthetic appreciation. George Landau, a Victorian critic, says that Ruskin's emphasis on beauty derived from historical associations aids his criticism of contemporary architecture. Ruskin finds the homes and public buildings of his England constructed without style, without regard to permanence, and without meaning for the men who inhabit them. Since he wishes to correct these deficiencies, he places great emphasis upon historical associations whose presence, he says, will ensure both that an edifice influence the life of the inhabitant and that it be solidly constructed, this latter because if a building is to endure long enough for historical association to accrue, then it must be well made. So Ruskin's not arguing for a new style of architecture. He was lamenting the plainness and the soullessness of the architecture designed and built since the Gothic cathedrals of the medieval period. He finds certain styles such as Baroque unacceptable because they exploited illusions and therefore were not truthful. Now, during the Victorian era, Thomas Carlyle demanded that attention be given to history. In his essay on history, he says that meaning in the present and the future can be known only as the past is studied. For though the whole meaning lies far beyond our ken, yet in that complex manuscript, covered over with formless, inextricably entangled, unknown characters, nay, which is a palimpsest, and had once prophetic writing still dimly legible there, some letters, some words may be deciphered. Okay, and then this talks about this inner text and this palimpsest that allows the voices of the dead to speak. So Uhlig is a critic, and he says that what you have is you have the structure, multi-layered structure of works or texts that are saturated with history, which is the palimpsest. So deciphering the present moment of the text as it relates to many past moments reveals the intertextual meaning the text seeks to convey and the critic to uncover. And this is true in architecture as well. A very famous architect, a philosopher of architecture is Peter Eisenman, and he talks about this architecture as text. And I've got several slides on that, but we're going to go ahead. We'll just end with this last one. Thus, in architecture, it is possible to say that text is what always exceeds the immediate response to a visual or sensory image That is, that which we see on the surface as the story, or that which we see as the beautiful, this is the heart of the matter. Any site contains not only presences, but the memory of a previous presences and the imminence of a possible presence. The physical difference between a moving thing, dynamism, and a still one, stasis, is that the moving one contains the trace of where it has been and where it is going. The introduction of this trace or condition of absence acknowledges the dynamic reality of the living city. Now, we're going to look at a couple of examples to illustrate this. The first one is by Peter Eisenman, who is this philosopher, and he designed the memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe. So it's finished in 2004, inaugurated on May 10, 2005, 60 years after the conclusion of World War II. The memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe, also known as the Holocaust Memorial, was built in Berlin by Eisenman. Here it is. There's a Holocaust tree, and it's all those blocks you see there. That's the memorial there. And that is an aerial picture, so you get a feel for it. It's not what you typically think of as a memorial. But already you're looking at the Palimpsest, aren't you? It's a memorial that's based on history. So you have 2,711 pillars planted close together in undulating waves, represent the 6 million murdered Jews. Open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is accessible from all four sides. One of Eisenman's primary aims has been to make the memorial an integral part of the city. Standing on an uneven piece of land, the stela almost fall into the center of the site, rising up again towards the edge, forming a myriad of uneven stone corridors. Walking down one of these passages is disorienting and scary. You can't see who is approaching you nor who is behind. The tilting ground and lack of vision offers some small idea of the Jewish experience in World War II. Your past snatched away, your future insecure, little hope of escape. Within this work, I came back to the heart of my identity, Eisenman says. He says, it stands there silent. The one who has to talk is you. Then we look at Daniel Lebeskind, opening in 2001. He also created the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which showcases 2,000 years of history of the Jews in Germany. And you have exhibits there. The other one is Kollegenhaus, the former courthouse, and the new one. Now this one you'll find interesting. You see the courthouse in stark contrast to the new museum, right? And notice there that the museum is very zigzaggy, and it's supposed to represent something. I don't know if any of you picked it out, but it's supposed to be a twisted Star of David. I don't know if you saw that, but that's what's supposed to be there. It covers 161,000 square feet. It is entered through an underground tunnel. It also has a void there, a space about 66 feet tall, with nothing in it except 10,000 iron faces that are called fallen leaves, and that's part of the memorial. It has 3 intersecting tunnels, which are said to represent 3 pathways of German life for the Jew: continuity with German history, immigration from Germany, and the Holocaust. And then the second building that I want to look at within is the One World Trade Center, which was formerly called the Freedom Tower. It was started in 2006. It's supposed to be finished in 2013. It will be the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, rising 1,776 feet. You think that has any significance? Yes, it's a symbolic for 1776. And this is the final design of that One World Trade Center. Now, he's not involved with the other buildings there, just this one now. He was originally, but some have been reassigned since then. But it's supposed to rise 1776 in the air, feet in the air. And then when he proposed initially for ground zero, you really got a feel for what he was trying to do. So I have just a couple of excerpts from that. He writes, I arrived by ship to New York as a teenager and immigrant, like millions of others before me. My first sight was the Statue of Liberty and the amazing skyline of Manhattan. I have never forgotten that site or what it stands for. This is what this project is all about. He says here, so I went to look at the site, to stand within it, to see people walking around it, to feel its power and to listen to its voices. And this is what I heard, felt, and saw. He talked about the great slurry walls are the most dramatic elements which survived the attack. The foundations withstood the unimaginable trauma of the destruction and stand as eloquent as the Constitution itself, asserting the durability of democracy and the value of emergence of life. Now, not all of this has happened. This was his original proposal, so it's a little bit different now, but some things are still there. So he talks about the sky, and he says eventually, what happened on 9/11 was not something abstract. It happened to me. Now, in terms of design, Libeskind's best buildings are connected strongly to history and deeply influenced by that history. Interestingly enough, he happened to be attending the opening of the Jewish Museum in Berlin as the Twin Towers were attacked. He flew back to Manhattan on the first available flight, feeling that he had to be there. Libeskind's master plan for the revitalized Ground Zero is of a sacred site, not just real estate, a palimpsest of the site itself. The design stands as a true description of palimpsest. As this important anniversary comes and goes, we can appreciate the work of great architecture and design, which helps to commemorate that awful moment when the world changed forever. So, I want to conclude then by asking, how is Ruskin relevant to today, to these architects who are of this particular, sometimes called the deconstructionist school? Because Peter Eisenman knew Derrida, and I don't know how familiar you are with all that philosophy, but it's connected to that. So, why should Ruskin's philosophy function as a palimpsest for modern and contemporary architecture? Here's why, I think. When first principles are applied, and that's what he's talking about in the 7 lamps of architecture, aesthetic integrity is maintained, truth and beauty are manifested, the palimpsest of history is integrated into the structure, the reflection of God is contained in the building itself. The architecture may also point beyond itself to something else, complementing it, expanding it, or transforming it, such as in Gothic architecture. Applying these Ruskinian laws and virtues to today's architecture provides a framework that grounds the discipline in meaningful theological and philosophical underpinnings from which inspiration and creativity may emerge. Now, of course, the question for discussion would be, did Peter Eisenman and Daniel Lebeskind accomplish that? I'm not saying that they had Ruskin in mind when they built. Did they accomplish it? And then secondly, how can it be integrated today if indeed we agree that these concepts can be innovative and included in architecture and building construction? Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions or listen to comments. Yes?
I see the connection to Palimpsest with most of Libeskind's, whatever his name is pronounced. But with the first one you mentioned, the memorial, the Jewish memorial, you said it was a memorial based on history. Isn't that kind of redundant? Like, since a memorial is remembering something in the past?
I think the answer would be, how is it based on history? You know, what way do they allow the history to inform the architecture? So yes, a memorial is a tribute to history, but it's how that site itself speaks to the architecture. I think that's what the palimpsest would say. There's that text or that undertext. What if it hadn't been built in Berlin? What if it had been built in Washington, D.C., which we do have one there. I've been there, and it's really quite haunting. How would that be different, and how is it different? how does it inform the architecture? Mm-hmm.
No question, just a comment. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you. That was brilliant.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes?
How can we apply that to less, I guess, less ambitious forms of architecture?
I think that's a very good question, and if you'd given me 2 hours, I was going to talk about that, because I think part of what Ruskin is saying is let's have a little beauty and passion for the architecture we do, and today we have, it's for simplicity, efficiency, and really, if you look at new office buildings being built, they're totally for utility. They're not there for beauty. And I think Ruskin is arguing for the beauty, the aesthetic, the moral good. I mean, when you look, and I think most of you probably have visited Gothic cathedrals. You walk in there and something happens to you. I mean, you are not the same when you leave. And I can't say that about most office buildings. Now, I realize it might not be on the same scale, but what if we had office buildings that we looked at and said, that's really beautiful. Or that does something to me. And we don't want to spare the expense, we want to get that quickly, we want to hire as many people as we can, as cheap as we can to get it done. We don't have that sense of the aesthetic that Ruskin brings us. And I really think that is my main message of this whole thing. And I think that honors God. Work well done. And that we have joy. I mean, Ruskin talks about the joy of the stone carver. Whatever happened to whistle while you work? We don't even think about that. We just go to work, do it, just to get it done.
Well, you can see that this transcends architecture into anything that we make or anything that we do.
Absolutely. I thought when I was doing this of Dorothy Sayers' beautiful essay, Why Work? And she talks about a thing well made and how it honors God. She has this beautiful paragraph, especially in that essay. Yes?
How important is it that this all be done without mechanical equipment? I thought it was sort of a little bit wacky. Even in his time.
Well, yeah.
Everything done by hand is better. I mean, you hear that in manufacturing today. I would say a lot of manufactured goods are far better quality when they're not handmade. Sorry. But that's the way it is. A good machine can often be much more consistent than a sort of haphazard hand worker, okay? And so as an engineer, I find that to be sort of a wacky idea.
Well, I can tell you what he would say. He would say, okay, I'm not saying necessarily that is the correct answer, but he would say, look at the stones from the Gothic cathedrals. It's true that they may not be all perfect, but in the striving, it shows the imperfection of man striving to be perfect. In other words, we won't get there, but it's the active work that's causing us to be more perfect than we were before we started.
So the architecture is also a palimpsest of the workers themselves.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good way to say it. I should put that in my presentation.
I don't want a car that shows that, though.
Well, and
the imperfection of man and his striving to get it better.
Now, do you see?
I'd rather have one that really is more or less bright.
But do you see why I put that in there? Because I knew I would get that response. So I said, I'm going to cover myself for this particular presentation. I knew what would happen. Yes.
Art is very subjective, and need to be very careful because the tastes are very diverse with us, and architecture is a recognized form of art. I'm a little familiar with other, let's say, classical music is one of my hobbies, and I have very strong opinions, which I'm sure that not everybody shares. For example, I like Baroque music, which is improperly named Baroque because it's quite simple, it's straightforward, it's very appealing, it's very beautiful in my view. As you go to the art history, you move from classical music to romantic music, Beethoven, and which in my view seems to be artificial. He put the man in the front of his dramatic sentiments, which sound artificial and so on. And then you reach the contemporary music, 20th century music, which become a kind of noise and something far away from real beauty. And the same themes can be recognized in art. For example, you have Raphael or have Michelangelo, but you have also Picasso, which someone can think that Picasso is a revolt of the real truth, is a kind of rebel, saying, oh, God, beauty is not the real beauty, my beauty is, it can be perceived as a rebellion against God and the real beauty. So I wonder if in architecture there might be some thinking on the similar lines. That everything is subjective, you can find justification for any form of art, any form of architecture, but someone may come with contrarian opinions. They say, oh yes, it's against the golden rules of beauty and balance and equilibrium, the golden ratio and so on.
That's a good question. It reminds me of an essay by Madeleine L'Engle. She wrote a book called Walking on Water, and there's a chapter there called Icons of the True. And she deals with this very subject, and one thing she points out is that as Christians we bring to whatever we view the belief that we have, and therefore in some way it becomes Christic or inscripturated. Now, that wouldn't be everything, but she said, you put God beside it, and take someone like Martin Buber, a Jew, who didn't necessarily, he wasn't a Christian, but when you look at his writings, you think of in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. So you bring to that work itself the Christian experience you have, and it becomes inscripturated, it becomes Christic, because you bring that to it. Now, and she has the belief that you can take things that are secular and make them sacred. And she gives the example of the drinking songs in the past that have now become hymns.
All the holidays, all the Christian holidays.
Yeah, right. They become Christic. They become Christianized. So we have that power within us, in a sense. Maybe we have the flow of the Spirit to bring that to pass through the experience we have with it. Now, she wouldn't say pornography was or anything like that. She's talking about those artistic things that we express. Yes?
Two comments. One, as someone who's flying to Venice a week from today, I appreciate the guide that you give me to see. But one of the things that I thought is interesting is how the architecture reflects the differing changes of what's beautiful. I think, speaking as an engineer and a sports fan, I think of all these stadiums that were built in the 60s and 70s that were perfectly round, absolutely symmetrical, and people thought that was great. And then started in Baltimore in the 80s, people started building baseball stadiums deliberately asymmetrical. Even though they had space to make it symmetric, they chose not to. Kind of a different opinion of what really looks good to some extent.
There is a kind of revolt against the right angle. Your building is exact building.
And again, I reference L'Engle because she talks about that. She said, my parents love Wagner, I can't stand it. So, she says, there is that matter of opinion as well. Now, did you have a comment earlier? Okay. Yes?
One thing that, as he was going through the Southern lands, one of the things that struck me was, I think that Ruskin was, and maybe I'm just reading into it, but one of the things he was trying to get to is when we do design, when we are an architect, we need to have some view of building for permanence. Because, and I think this is a lot of the problems we're having in our modern society is, like in business, we went from the 10-year plan down to what can we do today to make the stock market or the stock price highest at the end of the quarter. You see in the engineering of things in our society, we have become a throwaway society. There is nothing, how many things do we have in our culture today right now, even in buildings, that is built to last? We have lost this view, and this is something that I think is detrimental to a Christian worldview, because everything a Christian is doing, we should have an eternal worldview, that the things we see, the things we do today has implications implications to our eternity. And if we fall into this short, next quarter, end of year type of mentality, just enough to get us by and when it falls apart, and we're going through in my field, computer science, that where I'm working right now, there's this argument about agile versus waterfall computer programming. And that agile is you do just enough to get the thing out the door, and then we'll fix whatever problems there are tomorrow. And there's no this view of permanence, and that's kind of what I was seeing with Ruskin.
Mm-hmm.
We need to keep in mind we should be building things for permanence, for enduring lasting.
And I mean, the cathedrals are certainly the
Example.
metaphor for that, because it took, what, 400 or 500 years to build one? A lot of times.
Yeah. I would say that may not always be true. I lived in Switzerland one summer, and the building codes there are so strict that houses are built to last a couple hundred years, but nobody can afford them. And so the net result is everybody lives in apartments. And so on the one hand, I want to build a house that I don't plan to live 200 years, and if I can't afford a house that would take that, then I'm going to be happy to build one that will last as long as I'm around. And so there may be a balance of saying everything should be made permanent, because 50 years from now there will be new technology, there will be better ways of doing it, different materials. Maybe some things are built to be replaced.
Yes, there has to be a balance, but when you
build
something to last a year,
I think it's important for it to last beyond us because we want to give to those coming behind us. We want to give to our kids from a psychological point of view. We want to, generativity is very important when we're facing the end of our life. We want to give back to those who are like our kids. And if we're building something that's going to end with us, then we're not going to be happy with it.
and you walk into these old buildings or things that have been there, and it doesn't have to be thousands of years, it could be a few generations. It brings to mind that there is something larger than us that we need to keep in mind.
Okay, I think we have, can we do 3 more real quick? Jonathan, and then we'll go these. You have one, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing I was gonna mention about the generational and the longevity is that there's actually a connection between the longevity and building by hand, because if it's fabricated, then it presupposes the means of refabricating. But if it's built by hand, then all it presupposes is the existence of humans. So,
interesting point.
Well, I was just going to piggyback on what you were mentioning, that permanence is not necessarily necessary anymore. I guess it's a little redundant, but like back in the Middle Ages, the progression was relatively stagnant for over almost 1,000 years, and as opposed to how technology was progressing just before and after the Middle Ages, and so nowadays technology is progressing so quickly that there's things. I mean, it's almost necessary that like within no time at all things are obsolete, and so they're looking for materials and ways to construct things that they can be deconstructed and reused in other ways in relatively short time periods, because permanence isn't as necessary as it used to be. I mean, some things need to be permanent, but a lot of stuff really just doesn't need to be permanent anymore.
Well, nobody wants a 10-year-old computer.
Exactly.
Plus it's all done burn anyways.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
This thing about beauty, and that's why I was very grateful for you for keying on beauty, is vitally important to the engineer from my perspective. I mean, both architecture and engineering are, from what I provided yesterday, are productive sciences. They produce something. And in a very literal sense, the vocation of an engineer, just like for an architect, is to produce something beautiful. And I say specifically vocation. I underline that word twice. Vocation, not just job, but vocation to produce something beautiful. And to kind of anticipate a response to that, it's only a half-truth to say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Beauty is subjective in the sense that it respects human experience. One person likes Wagner, another person likes Baroque. Okay? It respects that part of the humanity. But it's objective in the sense that it respects another aspect of our humanity, our rationality. The traditional definition of something that's beautiful is something that's unified, proportional, radiant. You only know those because you're rationally able to understand those as a unified, proportioned, radiant whole. So that's what we strive to do as engineers.
Very good. Well, it's just a final comment on permanence, for whatever it's worth. I got an iPhone for my birthday. I don't know how I live without it, but I did, but now I can't. And I thought, if I were on a desert island, it would probably last me 2 or 3 hours, and I couldn't use it anymore, right? Because I wouldn't have the electricity to charge it up, and I wouldn't have the wireless to use it. It would become totally worthless.
But if you had an engineer who could build you a solar panel.
There you go. If I had a solar panel, I'd keep it. So, all right. Thank you again.